2024, and we are planning to go back to Belize in 2026. It's a week-long trip, February 7th through the 15th. Teri is leading the trip. We're going to 3 community conservation sites. We're going to see ruins. We do snorkeling. It's an awesome trip. So if you have any interest in going, I can send you the details and the pricing. You can just email us at ccinfo@communityconservation.org and we will send that over. So that's it for me. Thanks for being here today.
And I see one board member, Ann Clark, is with us. You just want to say hi, Ann, and maybe something about, we're always looking for board members and people who, and we also have an ambassador at large program. So if you're not interested in being a board member, we also have like an ambassadors program where you can still help us. So anyway, just to let Ann introduce herself and maybe why she's on the board. And you also went to Belize, Ann, so.
Yeah, that was a trip. That was a trip. Yeah, been a longtime supporter of community conservation, and more recently, in the last few years, joined the board, trying to make a bigger commitment to it. I'll just say, everybody's remarking on weather and where they are. I'm in upstate New York, but I'm not actually having the snow that you're hearing all about. I have about 1.5 inches. Anyway, the Belize trip is way worth it. And I think I will say, for anybody who's just interested in community conservation, it's probably one of the best ways to get a feel for what started the organization, what the goals were as they started, and how they can be expanded, and the kinds of communities with which one is working when you're trying to bring about change or progress or whatever. So I would recommend anybody to go along on the Belize trip. It's a real eye opener with respect to that.
Thank you, Ann. Yeah, and we have other people who are connected to CC, like Barry Hartip, who did his master's in Belize, actually, and also came on that trip. But I think what we're going to do now is I will just start. We wanted to use this, like I said, pretty informally, just sort of, I'm assuming most people know enough about us. They kind of know where we're working and what we're doing a little bit. So I was going to provide some updates on those projects over the last year, sort of since this is the end of the year that's coming up. And so I do have some slides I want to show, just so I'm not just a talking head, so you can actually see some of the places and even a little video of some of them. But please, if there's any questions you have as I'm talking, you can put them in the chat. Kory, if they seem like ones you should break in and have me answer at the time, feel free to make that call. And you got that. You're watching the admin, right, Kory? Great. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share the screen and talk about our project. So there's so much I could talk about, right, in terms of community conservation's history and Rob Horwich, who many of you knew, and how, I mean, these transitions from losing a founder, we lost Rob in 2017. So it seems like what's been a long time, but it's still a big transition from going from sort of a one-man show to someone going around. He's kind of working on, people who knew Rob knew that he was a force of nature, going around working on projects, spending a lot of time in other countries. And since we've been transitioning, we're trying to pull those projects together in a bigger way and the partners together and sort of becoming more of a professional, institutionalized nonprofit. So that's always a transition. And we're always looking, as Kory mentioned, please share. If you support us and you know about us, please share with other people so that we can continue to grow. I'm going to go through some of our projects. The community excitement about doing conservation is endless. So all of our partners in all of these countries could be doing easily 2, 3, 4 times as much if they had the support to do it. It's good to stay small with community conservation. So our partners are very committed at the local level, but there's always, room for expansion and all of us becoming a bit more sustainable because even in country, a lot of our partners are looking for funds, but the community stuff doesn't get the huge grants, right? A lot of the support for it is quite small. So we really appreciate all of your support over the years, and we appreciate those who maybe are just coming in and learning about community conservation. So let's see here. Can everyone see the screen now? Okay, why is it not wanting to? Okay, there we go. I'm seeing so many things on my screen. So first of all, I just want to make the point that communities are really good conservationists. I just kind of want to lay the table a little bit before I talk about the projects and why, community conservation is different, right? Just to sort of establish, I mean, it's a term that's used all over the place. And we think the way that Rob approached it and the way that our partners approach it is actually quite different often than many places when you look at what they're doing with communities. So I just want to say, first of all, communities are good conservationists. So this at heart is about doing conservation, right? It's not about providing benefits to communities. It's not about convincing them of anything. It's about actually helping them control and manage areas. And in the literature shows that they can be as effective or more effective than traditional protected areas. And I also want to make the point how large scale this is, right? So if you combine traditional protected areas with communities doing this kind of work all over the world, we're going to get to some of those conservation goals of 30 to 50% of terrestrial habitats conserved. And then, of course, marine protected areas and community stuff has just been exploding in the last 5 to 10 years also. And again, just to sort of make sure we're all understanding the terms in the same way, when we say community conservation, we do mean communities conserving biodiversity. We mean that they have some form of land tenure, that they're making rules and participating in the rulemaking themselves, women, marginalized, young, old, everybody, and that they are the ones actually enforcing and monitoring those rules themselves, right? So it's coming from the community, they're doing the work. And then I always like to say, the benefits come out of that process, right? From that process of community conservation, you get better governance. You get better democracies, you get healthier communities, and you get more sustainable livelihoods. And I think one thing that makes this different is that often when people talk about communities, they're starting with the benefits. They're starting with trying to do alternative livelihoods, again, things that will sort of convince people to be interested. And in all of my experience over 30 years, Rob's experience over 30 years, communities don't need to be convinced. They need the support to actually just have the power over it, which they often don't, given government policies. And I have so many examples that I can talk more about. I don't have it in the presentation today, but I'm happy to talk more if people want to know about what's been happening at some of our older sites over the long term in terms of communities losing power, losing control. That can happen. So again, community conservation is a process of governance and management. It doesn't just equal benefits. It doesn't mean giving benefits to communities. It means supporting them to do the conservation. And again, this is can be a really large scale approach. You're starting community by community. We know it can spread fast when it's done well and it's effective. And we also know that if we look at some countries where they have policies to help communities, that it can cover a large part of the land mass. So there's a study by Rights and Resources Initiative, which talks about across 73 countries, which is 83% of land, over almost 20% is already controlled or owned by local communities. And into that, if those 19 of those countries actually truly enforced or supported all the policies they've created for communities, we could get up to 40% of terrestrial habitats, protected somehow by communities. And the only other thing I want to say in terms of sort of laying the table here is that I think one thing we often do when thinking of us as outsiders, whether it's as conservationists or it's people who support conservation in communities, we undervalue local conservation values. And that's most of my research, which again, I'm not going to go into here, but just that Rob and I both had the experience working in so many different places that there was no community that you couldn't walk into and have a discussion about the value of biodiversity. And they understood, right? And they had their own feelings about it and why it was valuable. So again, that we don't need to convince people, we have to support them and recognize the values they already have and not underestimate the diversity of values either. So I'm not trying to say that communities are homogeneous and all people support biodiversity. It's like even in your own family or your own village, like I live in Wisconsin, we have villages there. Not everyone agrees on everything, but there's always a place to start a conversation about biodiversity. Okay, so to get into some updates on our programs, community conservation has had more than 30 projects in 18 countries over 30 years. And to give you a tour of over the last year, what's been happening in those projects, we're going to start with Peru. And our partner there is Neotropical Primate Conservation. Rob started working with them way back in 2009. In Peru, the policy that they use is conservation concessions. And one interesting theme that's coming up more and more as we compare across our project sites and our countries and sort of create a network is the different policies. And it's becoming more and more clear that a lot of the countries where we work in, like Peru, has really good indigenous people's policies, but those policies don't necessarily support communities to do conservation. So in Peru, I've been trying with our partner to really understand when they do these conservation concessions, these are not necessarily just local communities. Like a timber company could get a concession, but a community can get a conservation concession. So can private landowners. And so it's not for local communities per se, but it's the tool that they can use to actually get people some form of tenure. So in Peru, our partners have been moving ahead. They've got so many communities after these big meetings and the work they've been doing. This, what Rob would call conservation contagion, is happening, and more communities want to have help from NPC to create their own conservation concessions. And a lot of that for Peru is doing paperwork with the communities, right? Is because they have to write biodiversity surveys, they have to do socioeconomic surveys, they have to have a management plan. So the role with our partner there is us supporting them to help those communities put those together. And an interesting thing that actually with the Wisconsin connection is that a contact in Wisconsin who's been working with his own NGO for rainforests introduced our partners in Peru to 11 communities up in the Amazonas area, which is a little bit north of where our partners currently work in the San Martin area, and to work with 11 indigenous Awajun communities over a large area. And this was started a few years ago, but the partners that they were working with have come and gone. And they haven't had like a stable partner relationship to actually get the paperwork done, to make it sustainable. And so that's a really exciting project to see NPC coming in, because they have that history of working with, once they commit to a community like, CC, our partners, we stick with communities for a long time. And they just got a new grant, using some seed money from us and this relationship with a local Wisconsin person. So that's pretty exciting. So there's no end to the work they could be doing. They're doing so much with so many communities and creating new conservation areas. This is one area, Yantalo, where it's 16 farmers who they've just finished the paperwork to help protect this hill area, and then their agricultural fields are around it. And what happens is, if they create these concessions, they can stop people coming in from other areas and cutting down trees and sort of gaining tenure themselves. So they can, as a community who lives there, they can protect it and keep people from invading from the outside. And this is the critically endangered San Martin TT monkey that lives in that protected area and in the area more broadly. That was a baby that we got to see a couple of years ago when I went. And this is another site, which is a little bit bigger, to the west of where they are in Moyobamba. And this is a much larger group trying to protect these hillsides. And as an example of conservation contagion, when I went with them on this trip, the community was like, we need help redoing our board and getting things done again. And we've been talking to local communities. So now we have 3 or 4 other places that would also like to start their own concessions. So that means we could start protecting this entire watershed and all the primate species and the rest of the biodiversity that's in there. So that's very exciting. In Cameroon, we have another partner that Rob also worked with, Dennis and Delo, and the community-based biosynergy management group. And a couple of years ago, there's a similar model where when Dennis, he is Cameroonian, he's worked there for a long time, but when he started his own NGO, we had a meeting a couple of years ago with a lot of people in Yaoundé, and some local community leaders came. And this is one, the guy in the white shirt there, and he is pointing out to Dennis where there are chimps. And what he told us initially was, please come and help us, because the chimps are getting farther and farther away from our villages. And so now Dennis has been there. He started a project to work with the community to sort of try to restore some of the forest that's getting lost. And also, this is like a remnant population of chimpanzees that no one knew was even up in that area. And they would like to turn it into community forest, and they're studying the chimp population, but this is not an area where community forestry, they have it in Cameroon, but they don't think of it as happening up in this sort of more northern area of Cameroon. So this is sort of, trying to figure, again, policies, it's like paperwork. What some of our posts I've been saying, a lot of conservation is paperwork, right? Trying to help communities even get tenure over areas is a huge step in this process. And so in this case, they're really working with the local government, trying to get them to understand what community forestry is, and get them interested. And so they're making a lot of good progress there over the past year. Another site that they have is an old community forestry site. There's research papers published on it over the last couple of decades. And these are with the Baka communities down in the south central. And here the forestry leader is showing Dennis sort of the size of their community forest. And he was explaining it's so small. So we have the forest now, but we can't hunt like we always used to hunt. So in this case, they've got community forestry, but they want help learning how to sustainably harvest wildlife, how to hunt sustainably using their traditional methods. And so they're creating a group around this Jaw Funnel Reserve, a group of villages and volunteer monitors, and coming up with their own system, using smartphones, but using their own pictures and their own local languages for monitoring the wildlife and figuring out the key variables. And they've made really great progress this year in sort of tying this network together and figuring out next steps around this area. So that's very exciting. Then we have, let's see, we're going to move to Nepal next. And I just want to say, so most of my work has been in Nepal. And one question I do get a lot is how do you stay hopeful, right, in this era of climate change and huge biodiversity loss, right? If you look on that side of things, you can get depressed pretty fast. And I feel really, really lucky that I was a Peace Corps volunteer back in Nepal in the early 90s when when community forestry started. And so community forestry in Nepal, they have doubled their forest through communities from a low of 26 going up to 45%. And a third of, over half, 30% of people are involved in community forestry, over half the households, they've managed to protect large wildlife. So if you come from that, what you've seen happen in Nepal, you can feel really, really positive, which is one reason why Rob actually first had the idea for this corridor in Nepal, going from Manas Biosphere Reserve in Assam, India, which is one of the most successful project sites we've had for the golden langur. So going all the way across, India, northeastern India, into this. Can you see I don't know if you can see my mouse there, but into southeastern Nepal. And these are all community forests along. In the bottom, you can see those dark green patches. That's all forest that has community forests. So we're working there. Again, the community forest is established. The communities have proven they're interested in forestry. And now, I made 2 trips this year. We're working on them learning how to put the conservation of wildlife into their management plans, right? What wildlife do we have and how can we protect them? And a couple of interesting things came out of the trips that I made this year. And one was, last year we started community-based anti-poaching units because they said, okay, this is great. We love learning what's in our forest. We love the camera trapping and just learning, but we have a poaching issue. So what can we do? And so this last year, we've started these community-based anti-poaching units out in the Far East, Morong and Japa. And we want to replicate that across the area in those areas where people say that they have serious poaching issues. In some areas, that doesn't seem to be their number one problem, and they have other things that they'd prefer to do. So we're both trying to adapt, but also have kind of a model that works across that whole area so that they can network and become one landscape driven by the communities doing the conservation. So again, the community forestry is successful, but they're like, well, we don't know, like if we want to get more wildlife in, what should we plant? What kind of fruits are good? And how can we, help with different species? And so it's been a really interesting conversation with them trying to figure that out. And this year we also, our partner, the Nepal Conservation and Research Study Center are going to start camera trapping. So we've already camera trapped in 2 of the districts, and they're going to start in the more central area. They've already done Udaipur in the center there, and they're going to start in Saptari and Sunsari. So that network, that landscape is increasing every year as we start working and with the communities in camera trapping. And they are seeing a lot of wildlife moving across that landscape. So when we were there in January, snow leopard had come down. And at first they thought maybe it was a captured one that had gotten out because snow leopards don't come way down into this Terai southern area of Nepal. So they thought well, maybe someone trapped it and brought it down and it escaped. But they found out looking at looking at its species that it had a goat from the far north. So it had come down by itself and dispersed. And so again, another lesson sort of Nepal shows you if you let animals, and even, we see this in the Western US or anywhere, animals will disperse, right? If you can create habitat and you can leave them in peace, they will disperse and they will take back over pretty quickly. So, so part of it is just letting people understand better, right? Like, okay, maybe they don't have much of an opinion about snow leopard, or maybe in this case, actually in Nepal, they were a little bit afraid because they don't always know the context of the animals that are in the wildlife. And so one of the interesting things too is even when people really appreciate the wildlife they don't always know, but how rare is it in the world, right? So I've had people say, what, you've never seen a wild elephant? And I'm like, no, because in the US, we don't have those, right? We don't always know how rare something is, even though, it's in our own backyards. Here's just a picture of some of the camera trap, and the guy in the middle there showing the communities there how to do camera trapping. And then here's from one of the best videos we got from the camera trapping that we did was that's a baby Chinese pangolin on the tail of its mom there. And pangolins are the most, 6 to 8 species. There's like 3 in Africa and 3 in Asia, and they're the most wildlife trafficked species in the world. So our program, one of the things we do with the communities is talk about pangolin. And here we are, we're showing them, we compiled videos from their camera trapping. So again, showing them what's in their own forest. Some things you just don't see, right? Unless you have a camera trap, even they may know it's in there, they may not know it's in there. They've never seen it maybe, like the pangolin you don't always see pangolin babies. So that's always a nice and fun thing to do. And then we are in Myanmar, of course, with the conflict there, things have been really difficult for our local partner, Friends of Wildlife. It's been hard. They can't really get out in the field much. They're doing a little bit in like center area with elephants. But the other thing they've been able to do a couple of trainings up with the Naga, which is up on the border of India with the Naga people who are indigenous people that are known for their conservation ethic. And as part of these biodiversity hero trainings that Friends of Wildlife and CC has been doing for a few years. There's a photo down in the lower left of the Biodiversity Heroes Training Center. They would bring people in from all the local community leaders from a bunch of different protected areas every year and do a training to help train and support local leaders to do conservation projects. And from one of these ones, they had a couple of Naga people who'd come down and they said, hey, would you come up to us? We have a couple of wetlands. And so this is a slide from them that they gave me when they're going up and working with a bunch of communities up there to protect these two wetlands and really building that sort of. So in Burma, in Myanmar, one of the things Friends of Wildlife really stresses is civil society organizations, right? CSOs, they say, or like NGOs, and helping, which really, again, this is linking to democracy and governance, right? At the ground level, after the history in Myanmar the local communities have had, they don't really understand the role of civil society, the role of an NGO, how that can balance out the government, how communities can advocate for themselves, and the important role they play in a democracy, in governance. And so that's just a huge piece in Myanmar for years of what our partners have been stressing there. So really linking, conservation into these broader issues of governance and democracy. So now we are moving into Thailand, where we started a project just in this last year, I think. So in 2023, we had just begun it with the University of Minnesota. And this last year, we made another trip or two between the two of us. And this again, the policy there is very hard. This is working with Karen communities inside of national parks. So they have no co-management role. There are no policies that actually support them to be involved in conservation. And what we're trying to do is work with the Karen, and they have a conservation ethic, but then how they can use that to help, protect the national park and have a relationship with the staff that is helpful. And so we're starting to do some camera trapping with them so they can, the local community groups, these youth clubs. I'm giving a presentation in this photo to a youth club in the area that our partner Rabbit in the Moon is working with. And I'm showing pictures from Cameroon up there. That's Adrian, one of the CBBM staff who's working on the Sommier project with the chimpanzees. And it was really interesting to see in like this group in Thailand, in a village themselves trying to figure out camera trapping and what kinds of conservation they're interested in doing and what the policies will allow them to do, thinking about what's happening across the world in like Cameroon or other places. So as we begin to partner across, build a network across our partners, not only are they sharing, but we're also trying to get the communities to start sharing more learning from each other. And so that's something else we're going to be building out over the next year or two even more. Here's a picture of the youth clubs learning camera trapping so they can start to see what's in there for us themselves. And then this is the Malaysia project, which this year I went to with Olivia, this is in partnership with the Smithsonian. This is the highway in Malaysia, although the bridges and roads are every year, there's more and more traditional bridges and roads for cars. And this is actually from more than this last year, but it's an example of how we're involving women in the broader community. So this started out as a Smithsonian project in a protected area. And Olivia, our partner with the Smithsonian, is like, I want to involve communities. How can I do that? And one of the steps was just to say to women, are you interested in being involved too? Because she'd only been working with the men to sort of do camera trapping in the national park. But in order to broaden out to the community and looking at what they wanted in their own forests, we wanted to involve the women. And we were like, yes, why didn't you ask us 2 years ago when you started your master's thesis? Of course, we want to learn how to camera trap. And so we went out and did an impromptu camera trap training. And then now the current project this year, what they identified as some of our partner Rose with the Sarawak Forest Corporation went in and did what we call an appreciative inquiry sort of exercise where you're sort of asking people, what do you want your landscape to look like? What kind of changes do you want? And the women started talking about, well, the hornbills are farther and farther away, and we don't think there's enough good trees for hornbills. So we would like to think about improving that around our longhouses. And the men were thinking about the orangutan and how there were fewer around the village. And so they came up with the idea of trying to look at the rubber. They plant rubber in their forests. And they wanted to say, well, the rubber has this invasive in it. And we were thinking these would be good patches for wildlife to help them move across the landscape if we could make the rubber trees, which are our livelihood, also better for wildlife, right? And get rid of this invasive species which takes over. And so they're starting a process of reforestation, restoration of these rubber sites and seeing what's possible and how it will impact wildlife. So this is an interesting place where things are in pretty good shape. This is a pretty remote community near a protected area and almost trying to get ahead of the curve, right? So in Malaysia, again, there's a lot of recognition of indigenous people's rights. These are indigenous people, but it doesn't seem to translate in the policies and them actually, what can they actually do? What kind of co-management or management can they actually do, right? Yeah, their rights to an area are recognized, their traditional rights, but how do the government doesn't necessarily help build their capacity or their governance or their ability to manage that wildlife or biodiversity or habitats. And so that's the role we're playing there, is trying to help build that side of things and help them learn how, to advocate for themselves in terms of what goals do they have, what changes are they seeing, and how can they help impact that to fit their objectives and desires. And then finally, in Bangladesh, we're hopefully going to start a new project. This just came up. I'm only part-time with CC, actually, as part of us being a small organization. I'm only half-time. And I did a consultancy for USAID in Bangladesh and met these amazing young people who were birders. But what they were saying is our wetlands are just disappearing so fast. And when we go out and look at the birds and we share photos with the communities and the children, they're all really interested and they all want to learn. So we would like to work more with the communities and try to conserve wetlands. And then the woman, Firhan, in the middle there, she contacted me and we were starting discussions on how they can go out to the wetlands and what is the process. So they want to start from scratch. Like, they're birders. She's working with also a remote sensor professor, and they're like, we don't know how to work with communities, but we want to protect these wetlands. What should we do? And so I just had a meeting with them talking about, well, first you just go out and talk to people, right? Just go out and talk and see what they're interested in doing. Talk to the local communities. What changes are they seeing in those wetlands? How do they feel about them? It's usually rarely the local communities impacting the wetlands the most. A lot of it's development and hotels and the elites who are getting access to these areas and then changing them. And so I'm like, you got to go out and just start having conversations. So we're at the beginning of that process, and that hopefully will build into what we want to do this year. And that's the end of sort of the slides that I have. And I wanted to talk a little bit about next year. And then we can go into questions. And so next year, again, we're going to be we've been doing workshops. Oh, I forgot, in Nepal, we've been doing workshops too. So both online and then in Nepal, we've been doing workshops for community conservation and trying, and then ultimately we want to put those courses online and make them more accessible to people. And that's a big part of us building this network, right? Trying to get the resources out there for people who want to work with communities but aren't sure how to do it, providing workshops and materials online. And so I'm going to be going this next year. I will be going to Cameroon and doing one of those in March. And I was supposed to go to Peru in January, but they are just too busy and they've got too much going on. So they want to delay it for a little while. Let's see. And then, yeah, so building that network and continuing all these projects are the major things that we're hoping to do over this next year. We mentioned the donor trip already. Oh, and a couple other things just in terms of events we had this last year. We had a plaque laying event in Gaze Mills for Rob Horwich, our director, and every year we do have an open mic event that Ron Byers sponsors for him. So if you are in the Wisconsin area and you like going to Viroqua, which is a beautiful town, we do have that comes up in August. You can go visit Rob's tree in Gaze Mills and come to the open mic event. Let's see. Oh, and I'm also in talks with our local. So Rob did a lot of work in Wisconsin, sort of helping to initiate a lot of the community conservation projects in Wisconsin. So we're also starting to look at how can we tell the stories of what happened in like even Wisconsin or other places in the US. How do we tell those community conservation stories as well as these international ones? Because they actually are quite similar, but you'll see there's not really much literature that actually looks at it from that perspective or even the stories. So we're looking at telling stories from Wisconsin about community conservation and linking those more to the international work that we do. And as part of that, I want to start doing some of these workshops that I'm doing like in Nepal and the activities. I think there's a home for them here in the US too. So Valley Stewardship Network in Viroqua that Rob helped to start. I'm talking with them about, can we do some of the activities we do with communities in Nepal or other countries? Let's do them in Viroqua. We do a lot of talk about values and have these interactive workshops. So let's try and do that with people in the US too, and really start to link these stories better, right? So it's not Like we do international work and people often ask me, well, what do you do in Wisconsin? And unfortunately, there's already so much going on in Wisconsin. There's not really a niche for us to start from scratch on community stuff. But I think this is a real niche that we could help with, is sort of linking across these stories and the roles that communities are playing. So for example, there's one, the Driftless Land Conservancy has said, usually they work on like private easements, but lately they said people are coming to them as a community of landowners, right? Like 8 or 16, and they're saying, we want to conserve across our landscape, right? And our contact there was like, they're demanding that we work with them as a community, not as like a private landowner, right? So I think there's some really interesting themes to tease out there, and ways that we can support with the stories from overseas too, of how do you work with communities? What are some of the things, that can arise, and how do you do that? Yeah, so I will stop there and take any questions that anyone has about any projects or anything. Even we were saying, even we had one question about, let's see, what was
We have 3 in the chat that I've
okay.
noted, but I know that you also got a few through the email as well. So we'll start with the ones that are in the chat. Barry
Okay.
asked, what is being poached in Nepal?
So interestingly, in Nepal, it is not really any longer, I mean, like in the slide, you saw that it said rhinos and tigers, sort of those charismatic megafauna that there's been so much work done to protect them. Those don't get poached very much. But what I've realized the last 5 or 10 years is that, and the communities then are confirming, it's deer that are getting poached locally. So where we're working in the Southeast, when they say, poaching is a problem, it's basically deer getting poached for meat. And there's a lot of other things that are going to get taken, right? No one even knows, I think, because in Nepal, they're so focused on tigers and rhinos in protected areas that I only know of one study where someone tried to get a handle on deer poaching. But without deer, there's not tigers, there's not leopards, right? So I think in Nepal, there's so much that's been done. This is a huge gaping hole in our knowledge.
Our pangolin as well. They are also being trafficked.
Pangolin as well, not so much by local communities though, right? So those are more like networks of people who might come in and know, right? So it's a local, and I don't think in Nepal it's happening, but I haven't seen numbers, but the awareness about pangolin has really grown. It's like, I think there's been a lot of money for pangolin in the last 5 years or so. So there's a whole bunch. So Nepal is amazing because they're such a long conservation history, which has meant that this current generation of 20 to 40-year-olds, they have this amazing cadre of young conservationists who are trying to just do things on their own, and they're out there across the landscape. And there's probably 5 to 10 of them just working on pangolin right now in different parts of Nepal, and and in Nepal, they take communities for granted in a way. So we do this workshop because I think they don't necessarily even think about what it means. They just take it for granted because of community forests sort of being across the landscape. They know they have to work with them. It doesn't mean they always know the best way or how, or sort of what the bigger patterns are to it, but they take it for granted that it has to happen. And so it's pretty exciting to work in Nepal. Again, it's a great place to work for this kind of stuff.
Barry also asked, can you talk more about the Valley Stewardship Network and what they do?
So the Valley Stewardship Network works around the Viroqua area with landowners on water quality. So it's across private lands. It's looking at, the streams and the watersheds. It's a watershed approach. They put together watershed councils, from my understanding. We share an office with them in Viroqua at this point. And so that's one reason why I'm looking to partner with them. And all these models are slightly different than the way we might walk into a community in Nepal. But there's a lot of parallels. And so it's fun to explore with them, like what they think their members, what would be helpful for their members in terms of thinking about, are they a community, or are they like a set of private landowners and issues like that? So it's new to me too, right? Thinking about land trusts. Sorry, I hadn't really thought about
I thought you wanted
land
the
trusts
next question.
Right. At the local level, about Wisconsin, a lot of the groups that maybe we resonate with are land trusts, right? And that sort of become more and more clear to me to think about, well, what do land trusts look like? How does that relate to communities?
Well, that's exactly why I asked that.
Yeah.
Because I'm involved also with the land trust here in Baraboo.
Yeah. And that was actually on my list. I'm coming to give
When
a
you
talk
said,
there.
yes, exactly. When you mentioned driftless, I'm like, okay, I'm just seeing so many synergies between the organizations and the approaches. But
Yeah.
there's a nuance there that I think would be really great to explore.
Yeah. And I think Valley's, yeah, sorry. And then the Driftless Land Conservancy, one of their comments also was they often feel very alone. You feel alone in the driftless area. There's like so much happening. But I think it is hard for organizations to sort of link across each other, right? And share, like anywhere, right? It's always hard. We all have too much to do. Okay, Kory, sorry.
No, it's okay. Anne asked, what kind of wetlands are the focus in Bangladesh, any co-use with crops like rice?
What are the wetlands? They're large lakes, actually. So large lake wetland areas up in the hills in the northwest. And I have not visited them, so I would have to follow up. I have some nice slides and information from our partner about them. But they are large lakes up in that area with an abundance of wildlife because it's very remote areas up in, you're getting into the eastern Himalaya there. So it's an area that would even have tigers and things. And would, in theory, could even link to Nepal and our landscape from Nepal to Assam, northeast, could go all the way to the northwest Myanmar and through northeast India.
Awesome.
Yeah, I asked because actually it occurs to me one of the things we have going here in New York State is actually, and it's already started in Vermont, is some sort of I'm searching for the word. It's a sort of experimental expansion, perhaps, of rice farming in this area. It's successfully established with one small farm in Vermont. And what struck me prior to this, and that's why I asked, is this across the globe, the necessity to make wildlife conservation use of sustainably harvested or sustainably raised crops. I mean, we can't get away from the fact that in some cases we need real crops, not just, forest harvest of meat. And one of my grad students just finished her degree working with crows in Thailand next to one of their biosphere reserves. But it's converting from rice farming, which has been very rich for water birds. And you were talking about, wetlands and water birds, and it has been a very rich resource for water birds and other wildlife, to cassava farming, which is desperately bad.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
so it would be an interesting thing to take agricultural products in the US that should be sustainably and link them up with similar products in other countries as a network of how can we support waterbirds, shorebirds, water birds, migratory species with these crops.
Yeah. And in Bangladesh with the huge densities, so Bangladesh is so interesting because it's so densely populated. You cannot believe how, right? And there's a lot of biodiversity money and it goes into these really tiny areas like the Sundarbans, which are really actually quite tiny. And trying to get, USAID, we were recommending in that consultancy that a landscape, there's landscapes that are bigger than Bangladesh, when Yellowstone to Yukon or in Eastern Africa, right? So really thinking and integrating those things you're talking about, Anne, right? Thinking about crops because you've got so much pesticide and fertilizer and the mango crops in Bangladesh. They're like, well, if one spray is good, why shouldn't we spray 5 or 10 times? And it must just be so cheap, and so subsidized. And so, yeah, I mean, you've got to think about those things too, especially in these really densely packed landscapes, because they're right there together. And what's the next
We
one,
have
Kory?
2 questions from Jonathan. The first question is, do you have any projects you are doing in Southern Africa? If yes, in which country? If no, do we have any intentions of setting up specifically in Zambia? That was the first question.
We have no plans for expansion at this point, just because we need to expand our donor base and sort of have more resources available to us to do it, except for the Bangladesh one, because since I met them, and sort of hopefully they can drive it. So not at this point. We did have Madagascar was a project site. We have information on our website about that. And we supported that. When Rob was alive, he helped a lot with what was going on there. And then a couple of years ago, we also gave some seed money. So we did have that, but otherwise not at this point. But it'd be awesome at some point to get to the, where we might have a partner in every country and examples of the kind of community conservation we're talking about, right? It would be so great to have examples in every single country.
The second question is something you touched on earlier, but it says, is there any resource or literature of online trainings that can be accessed for people who are interested in community conservation?
Yeah, I mean, so our website has a bunch of resources. We have the original seminars that our founder put together, and we have a whole bunch of things that we've published, sort of peer reviewed. And we're also looking to get a lot more of that stuff up over the next year from the workshops that I'm doing, working on like a mini textbook that will provide resources. And so, yeah, we really hope to expand that out in terms of our activities to provide those resources for people all over the world. That would be one of the goals for this next year. But for small organizations, everything will takes time and effort, so it's not going to be as fast as we want. But
And Jonathan, I've dropped a link to the resources page in the chat for you.
and feel free to get in touch if there's specific things, right, that we can sort of target and help with.
I'm trying to think about how to condense down this next question. Did you also have questions that were sent in from the
Yeah, I do have
email?
one here. I have one
Okay.
that Kelly sent me, and it was from Meg. What are your essential packing items in every travel tips? Which is a fun question. And I would say two essential items that I always take with me when I travel is my Grail water filter, because Grail is the only company that I know of that's like a portable water filter that actually even gets rid of viruses, right? So that to me, I'm getting rid of all my heavy metals, everything. It's the only filter that gets rid of absolutely everything. So I always take that, and it's very, very nice and easy to take because it's the size of a water bottle. And then I also take coffee. I always take my coffee with me, often Wonder State coffee from Wisconsin. And then there's coffee in most places. Coffee's another crop. And when you're talking about crops, I'm like, coffee sort of cuts across a lot of these landscapes too. So coffee's another one that I take. And she also asked for travel tips that I had. And one of the funny travel tips that I didn't, so even people that I travel with a lot, I talk about, you can leave stuff in your hotels, right? So if you take too many things to the capital city, and then the hotel will keep your bag for you if you need to leave some stuff behind. That's usually what I do when I travel, because it gets to the point where you get hard of only having 2 t-shirts, right? It's easy to say pack minimalistically, and then you have no clothes. So I sometimes take more than I need, but I just leave it in the capital at the hotel for a while. And I think the other couple of things I was thinking about when with Meg's question was, you can't always say no to food. I'm always like, you need to keep healthy when you're traveling, and food is often a source of what makes you not so healthy. And I know when I first was in Peace Corps in Nepal, our trainers would tell us, never say no. It's so rude to say no to food. You've got to eat it no matter what. And people quickly learned that if you think it might make you sick, and you have to know yourself and your own stomach, right? But if you have to say no, it's really okay. People will forgive you, right? Just because it's so horrible to be sick. And then and also the other thing with traveling, it was sort of like Rob and I saying, we've never been in a community where people didn't want to talk about biodiversity. We've never been somewhere where, people are always happy to help, right? If you ask and you have questions about anything, it seems like people are always happy to help and give advice on things. So anyway, just some random thoughts about traveling. And just to sort of make it clear, any question is okay here. This what really was supposed to be informal, so it can be about anything, not just technical things or about communities and conservation.
2 more questions. One is also from Jonathan. And I kind of condensed his question down. How are our projects addressing climate change, particularly by engaging Indigenous communities in forest conservation and environmental protection?
Yeah. So I think climate change is always sort of an underlying undercurrent in all these projects. People know how things are changing, right? People know, like in Nepal, the conversations about, rains are coming too soon, too much, all these patterns are changing, and communities know it. And in terms of addressing climate change, often when you are protecting these habitats and having conversations about biodiversity and making that something the community can really begin to talk about, you're going to help address climate change too, right? The better job you're doing of protecting the environment from the ground up, the more you are at a local level going to be, at the local scale, mitigating climate change, but it's going to have repercussions across a larger scale. Like when I talked about the 40%, if we really had communities managing 40% of the land and making decisions that were good for their own health and their own systems of agriculture, they're probably going to make better decisions than when it's a centralized decision-making system by timber companies and larger agricultural companies, at least in the context in which we work. And that doesn't mean communities alone. So again, to be kind of a little bit wonky, you've got, the idea of polycentric governance and Eleanor Ostrom, right? Where communities need to have a say and they're the ones on the ground. But that means working again with, the NGOs, the governments, that it's going to take all those people to really, right, to mitigate, to address climate change. But communities have got to be, a huge partner in that. And community conservation is one of the ways that they can really be a partner in that and protect their own environments too.
Kate asks, do any of your projects incorporate tourism?
Yes. And Rob often incorporated tourism in that. So Belize, for example, one of our first projects had, they have a museum that Rob helped us support. And I think Rob probably, he thought about, like I talked about benefits, he put those sooner in the process than I would based on my experiences. Because what happens is, museums are infrastructure, communities can't keep buildings up. It's hard for them. You can put a museum up and have a nice display that within 5 years is outdated. And so 30 years down the line, Belize just updated their museum finally and got the money to build a new building. So, but in most places, so I tend to not to put that right up front and not to put a lot of effort into that piece of it, because I think those things often come along. Many of the countries where we work, like Nepal, it's people already doing a lot of tourism. They know how to do it. It's sort of working. A lot of these community forests, actually with domestic tourism, is just increasing hugely. So our role has actually almost been to say, whoa, let's integrate tourism in a sustainable way rather than as a benefit to convince you should be doing conservation, right? It's almost the opposite way that Rob might have brought it into a project 30 years ago. And so, yeah, it's kind of a complicated answer there. So tourism can play a role. It's not one that we emphasize a lot, and we try to get communities to think about how to do it sustainably. And we also, of course, with COVID, I mean, the reason that you don't want to bring in benefits, these sort of economic benefits, is the reason to do conservation is because when they disappear, so does the conservation may too. Not because people are not well-intentioned, but because they've been given like the wrong incentive in the wrong capacity, right? If you build the capacity to do tourism, do they have the capacity to manage and the knowledge through the camera trapping and track the wildlife and all that, right? So when COVID came and tourism went out the door, all of a sudden there goes that incentive is not there anymore. So I like to say, we have to start with the right incentives and get that right up front. And there's so much of that needs to be done that's what we try to really emphasize in our projects.
Great. Before we wrap up, can I just ask Kellie, do we still have any of the games left from Giving Tuesday?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to drop 3 pictures of the games as well. I don't know if anybody is interested in this, but we had a special offer during Giving Tuesday for people who, oh, it won't let me upload the photos. I'll address that in a second. But there was an opportunity to, if you made a donation of $300 or more, you got a special edition game from Nepal about community conservation. I don't know if Teri wants to talk about that a little bit more, or you could just go to our Instagram page or any of our social media and see the post and the videos about it. But I just wanted to let you guys know that that was there because there's only a few of those in production. And so if that's something that interests you, I would act on that sooner rather than later.
It is a limited edition, sort of Nepali limited edition. So it's printed on Nepali Lokta paper, and it's got Nepali game pieces. And we're hoping to make different versions of it. This one is sort of Nepal centric. And it's also a great learning tool. So it's part of a fundraiser right now, but we are talking about, we want to put it online and make it something that people can print out. Yeah, I actually have a copy of it here. My husband's actually the one who helped design it, and he's bringing me, so.
Yes, it'd be easier for you to
Here's
show
like
because for some reason I can't
Yes.
do
So
the
here's
photo.
here's the game board, and this is not the paper that it's printed on. This is just normal paper, but you'll get it on nice Lokta paper, and then you will get a nice little bag, a Nepali Thai bag with we have different kinds of game pieces you can choose from, and these are little brass pieces. We have some other little birds. And this is a nice introduction too. When we took it to Nepal, we used it both in the workshops with people, the students and staff of NGOs in Kathmandu. And at the end of the day, they just had such a fun time doing this. And it just introduces you to a lot of just the basic sort of building blocks of community forestry in Nepal. And it's also hopefully fun to play. They really enjoyed it. And we even took it out to the village and played it with some community forestry groups. And it seemed to translate well. And we also played it with some kids. So we want to get it up online also as part of the resources that we have. But as part of our fundraising, it's also this nice deluxe edition is available if you're interested. Is there any, so that was the end of the questions. I just want
there
to.
are no more questions in the chat. I think you've answered all of them.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Feel free to drop us an email if you have other questions or want to be in touch, or if I can help in any other way, let me know. We really do want to extend our network. Feel free, share our emails, sign up if you're not signed up for everything, and please share and let's network. So I know some of you are donors and some of you are like conservationists. So this is a great audience. Thank you so much for coming today.